Hi, and welcome to Common Sense America. I'm Eden Hill. Thank you so much for joining us. This is the month of May, Military Appreciation Month, and also Military Spouse Awareness and Appreciation Day, which is this Friday, May the 14th. So we got to you a couple days early, and I have the honor to introduce you to a veteran spouse, a fellow veteran spouse, a caregiver, and a warrior. Jennifer Moffat. She is a Tillman Scholar. She is dedicated and advocated for veterans and the NSW community. She's a proud wife of a Navy SEAL veteran for more than 22 years of dedicated service. Jennifer, thank you for joining Common Sense America. Thank you for being with me, and thank you for your friendship. You're just a phenomenal woman. I just adore you.
Oh, Eden, I adore you as well. And thank you for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. So, we both have a couple things in common. We are both veteran spouses, and we both have been tackling a beast, and that is the Veterans Administration and the Caregiver Program. And we have experienced things that no veteran should ever have to experience. So, as we are in the month of May, honoring our veterans, honoring those who are active duty, let's talk about your story. Let's talk about your husband's story. Let's talk about where this all began.
Okay. Well, for us, my husband's story really dates back to starting in 2005. He was injured by an RPG attack in Iraq in 2005. He sustained a traumatic brain injury at the time, but back in that time, we really weren't identifying traumatic brain injuries. In fact, I don't believe we started doing concussion checks in the field until about 2008. He struggled tremendously for a number of years, and I watched his mental and physical health substantially decline. His cognitive abilities also declining over time, and just an increase in frustration. Fast forward to 2012, he attended the Marcus Institute for Brain Health. And it was at that point that we received the diagnosis that he had sustained a traumatic brain injury. And a lot of the issues that he was dealing with and a lot of the mental health conditions that had surfaced were the direct result of that traumatic brain injury. In 2014, he was medically retired from the military after over 22 years of dedicated service in the SEAL teams. And we began our process on the transition and the veteran side of the house. Mm-hmm. That has been a tremendous struggle, a very difficult path, and one I did not expect. Really, I believe when you hit that transition point, you think that it's going to be a new world and it's going to be a really positive thing. We're going to move past the military and move on to civilian life. And what we found is we haven't really been able to fully make that transition. My husband has struggled with making that transition both from the military as well as from the battlefield. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a lot of men and women out there that are suffering from similar struggles. We have spent 20 years at war. It's a very long period of time to put this kind of trauma and endurance on these individuals. Mm-hmm. And we're seeing the effects of those now.
Mm-hmm. And for 20 years, I sit there and say, my husband and your husband aren't that far apart in age. And for them to be a part of certain war and time periods, and then they come home, they retire, and they're expected to just shut it off like that. Mm-hmm. That's not the way it rolls.
It is not the way that it rolls.
And in that, we are seeing so many different veterans either have their TBIs, their PTSDs, guilt, survivor's guilt. Mm-hmm. And then we have the 22 suicides a day.
Yes, it is an epidemic in our community.
It really is.
And one that needs to be addressed. We're not doing enough.
No, we're not. We're not. As veteran spouses, from one veteran spouse to another, we were introduced because of a mutual friend who is a retired Navy officer. And she instantly saw a connection between the two of us because she knew I was studying through the REACH program with the VA Caregiver program. I wanted to learn more. But to be honest with you, Jennifer, that book about this thick, I already knew everything in it.
Mm-hmm.
The VA was basically checking a box.
Yes. I
And
find that occurs often.
it does. It does. So I want to talk to the caregiver piece. You have been going through so many different aspects in this journey of your husband's health. And you
Yes.
sent an article to me, an op-ed, and you really became very vulnerable in this op-ed. Talk to me about that moment when you were seeking assistance from the VA Caregiver program. What happened in that moment?
That moment was very scary. I was worried for my husband. I was worried for my entire family. His mental health had deteriorated substantially. It seemed as though the medications that he was being provided were making him worse, not better.
Right.
And he just was not getting the adequate care that he really needed. He started acting very strangely, and I could tell that something more was going on.
Mm-hmm.
I took him to the VA Medical Center or the outpatient clinic there, and in desperate hope of just finding somebody to help me because I was extremely scared for his safety.
Mm-hmm.
What happened there, he did end up having an episode and had to be admitted into the emergency room. At that point, he was transported and sent to a psychiatric hospital where he was institutionalized for a period of time. It turns out many of the medications that my husband was taking were not helping him. They were actually prompting a lot of these mental health episodes. He was diagnosed with bipolar 1 disorder, and that came he was 45 or 46 years old at that diagnosis point, and it was after he retired. They have since connected that as the direct result of his traumatic brain injury. But I do believe that that component has been missed and continues to be missed for a number of other veterans because it had such a late onset for him, because it wasn't something that developed naturally over the course of his late teenage years and into his early 20s.
Right.
That onset didn't come until his mid 40s. And so the doctors really weren't looking for it.
Mm-hmm.
And your typical diagnosis and treatment options that I found with PTS and with depression and anxiety is to prescribe anti-anxiety medication.
Right.
Prescribing that to somebody with bipolar disorder without coupling that with a mood stabilizer is what prompts and can prompt these manic episodes. And as these manic episodes continue to occur, it's almost like a heart attack on the brain. Each episode gets a little bit worse. They get a little bit longer in duration. It's really damaging to the brain. So on top of already having the TBI, these episodes that he was experiencing was also doing further damage to his brain.
Do you think, so the medication that the VA prescribes, it seems, hands up a little bit here, but it seems to me that a lot of what they prescribe is just a mask. And it's just, again, checking those boxes. Yes, we gave this to this veteran. Yes, yes. So do you think that if the VA was more aware of what they were giving to our veterans, perhaps, just perhaps, some of these health issues that are popping up wouldn't necessarily pop up? And I know that's a loaded question, but in many senses, you have to sit there and ask that common sense question.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I can't argue that I would absolutely assume that there is an impact there. I'm sure it depends on the individual. I understand the purpose of checking that box. Some people are going to be respond very well to medications and that sort of treatment. And that is your first go-to. But if that isn't working and you're noticing these other things,
right,
looking deeper into that is where I feel like the disconnect is.
Mm-hmm.
And I know within the VA system, particularly, that continuity of care is a component that's missing.
Yeah.
You have some doctors, some nurses and physicians that are there for an extended period of time, but so many of them are moving around. They're not consistent as far as seeing the same patients.
Mm-hmm.
And so, particularly when you're dealing with mental health conditions, that continuity of care is so important.
Mm-hmm.
It's really difficult for the veteran to relive all of that and to bring all of that forward to a doctor, to a therapist initially, but to have to keep revisiting that and tell the same story over and over because it's a new doctor, a new therapist. I think that we lose a lot of people who might have been really committed to their recovery and treatment, be really frustrated and lose that momentum for that and
Right.
become discouraged.
Where in this time period have you been able to get help? Where have you been able to get resources? Has the VA helped you at all?
As far as the Department of Veterans Affairs, they have caused more hurt than they have helped. And I am very sad to say that. I was hopefully optimistic,
Right.
particularly with my husband's service record, that his injuries and ailments would not be questioned.
Mm-hmm.
His service record reflects that those injuries would be a normal result of his 22 years as a Navy SEAL. But I do, and I'm sorry, Eden, I've lost my thought there.
No, you're fine. You're fine. We from the caregiver standpoint, what has been your support, your foundation to your support, knowing that you were very hopeful that the VA would do something to
Yes.
assist your husband?
In fact, when I discovered the program, I had a sense of relief. It was a program that I didn't know about its existence.
And this is the caregiver program?
The caregiver program. I stumbled upon it by chance, which in and of itself is a bit frustrating for me, considering that my husband went through the medical discharge process.
Mm-hmm.
But once I did discover the program, reading the criteria, it was one of the few resources I found that provided resources for protection and supervision. And that doesn't necessarily mean that somebody is at a risk of suicide.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes that protection from themselves is just from leaving the stove on, not having that cognitive awareness that they once had.
Right.
It doesn't have to be suicidal ideations. And I think there's a bit of a disconnect there sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
That supervision and protection, a lot of it is encouragement.
Mm-hmm.
And just always knowing and encouraging that they're doing what they need to be doing,
Mm-hmm.
giving those kind words,
Yeah.
letting them know that they're not alone,
Mm-hmm.
and showing that support, but at the same time, making sure all of their appointments are kept, keeping all of their medical necessities in line, while also providing supervision to make sure that they are making good choices for themselves, that they're not putting themselves into dangerous situations just simply because they don't understand it anymore. They don't have that awareness that they once had.
Mm-hmm. What has been the time period from the beginning to current of your husband's decline, if you will, and where you saw it way before the VA saw it, and you were taking action where no one else is going to?
I think that really started before he was retired. I really started noticing things that were just different for him, things that were taking a lot longer for him to complete that he would normally not struggle with at all.
Right.
And so really the first place that I went for assistance and support was the command.
Mm-hmm.
His commanding officers were wonderful, very supportive, and that's the first place that I turned. But that was when we were at the active duty level.
Yeah.
When we got to the VA component, I really felt deserted, abandoned. There's very little guidance. And I didn't know really who to reach out to. There isn't that connection piece with the VA to really make it a smooth transition,
Right.
one that I found. And the caregiver support program, I thought was really going to provide a lot of help. That program started in 2011
Mm-hmm.
and is still active today.
Mm-hmm.
And as I said, it does provide both for those that struggle with ADLs, need assistance with daily living and
Right.
physical disabilities, but it also has the component for TBI, for your invisible injuries that are so often not recognized.
Right. Let's talk about the invisible for a second. The Earlier this week, I had a nonprofit on here who their headline for serving our veterans is healing unseen wounds. And
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was very powerful. And it is through the process of golfing, whether
Love
you,
that.
I know. And a lot of their testaments that they have on there are men and women who have lost their limbs. And yes, they are still in golf carts and they are out there, and the interview talked about how they lose all sight of all their frustrations and all their thoughts that they deal with daily because they're chasing a little white ball.
Mm-hmm.
And I know there's a little humor in that, but going back to the unseen wounds, the invisible wounds, let's talk about that for a second. What was some of the triggers that triggered you in regards to going through this process? And what would be some advice that you could give to veteran spouses out there who may not necessarily be in a caregiver role yet, but where they're like, oh, wait a second, I just saw that trigger. Do I need to do something? Do I file it? What do I do with that?
I understand. For our family, with my husband, some of the first things that I started to notice was isolating. He would
Mhm.
isolate a lot more. Times that he would normally maybe spend with family, he was spending a bit more time by himself and sitting on the patio alone, watching TV alone. The work days would get longer. I did figure out later that's because his tasks on the computer and whatnot were taking him longer. Those cognitive abilities were declining and things were taking him longer, and that was leading to a lot of frustration.
Mhm.
I noticed an increase in his drinking.
Hmm.
And I noticed that with a lot of people that struggle, that it's a form of self-medicating.
Yeah.
And so when they are noticing that something is going on, they may not be able to verbalize it. They may
Mhm.
not even be able to identify it. But
Right.
what they feel is uncomfortable. And so I did notice an increase in the substance abuse with alcohol.
Mhm.
And that is a slippery slope for
Mhm.
people to really watch, because that numbing really does become addictive. That
Mhm.
escape becomes addictive, not just the alcohol itself, but what it's providing for you.
It says a couple triggers, just to reiterate: the isolation
Yes.
and the alcohol aspect, and also the process in which things are done.
Yes.
So, so as you were saying, things were becoming a little bit longer through the workday for him. So
Yes.
triggers to look out for a veteran spouse, whether you are a new veteran spouse, whether you have been around your husband for many years and you know what makes them tick. So my question to you now is the caregiver program that you had applied for. You had said to me in an offline conversation, a high percentage of those who are denied this program.
Yes. The
Talk,
last,
yeah, can you talk to that? Yeah.
sure. And I will admit in full disclosure that some of my percentages are now a little bit probably off we had a pause on all discharges from that program that
Uh-huh.
was set through Congress.
Mhm.
So I know we have more participation because there is a pause on discharges from the program.
Mhm.
But generally speaking, the program's acceptance rate runs at, or denial rate runs at about 87%.
That is very high considering the amount of veterans that we have in this nation. That is
Correct.
extremely high. And
It's very high. And these are people that already are diagnosed and rated for these injuries.
mhm,
This has already been narrowed down to a smaller group of individuals. This is not just the masses of veterans retiring, active duty retiring, coming in and applying for these programs.
mhm,
It's very specific for people who require certain needs.
mhm,
And so to have that 87% denial rate, it's very discouraging.
mhm.
This is not something that I was aware of when we first applied. It perhaps would have tempered my excitement for
Right.
acceptance into the program, but I was very much unaware of that. Reading through the criteria, there was not any doubt in my mind that we would qualify for the program.
Mhm,
His doctors were very supportive, wrote very lengthy, detailed nexus letters for the
mhm.
program, supporting his acceptance and need for that. So it was very surprising. But what I've come to learn just over the course of the last 5 years is that it wasn't a personal issue. I took it very personally for a long
Yes.
time, but
Yes.
this is a systemic issue. This is across the board that we have this 87% denial rate. And this program has had just an onslaught of ongoing problems, whistleblowers coming forward, bringing information forward. Veterans' records have been misused, false information has been put in them. And this has occurred on a massive scale.
Mhm. So, from your standpoint, what did you do after you said, you know what, I have to remove myself personally from this issue? You, I know that you have in your back pocket a lot of resources, but it
Yeah.
wasn't something overnight that you uncovered. It was years and years of research, getting your voice out there, of conviction, of, can I say, desperation.
Yes.
And what did you bring yourself to say, okay, this is not going to happen for us, but I am going to make sure that this does happen? What was that in between? What was that bridge to that next point for you?
Originally in the program, and this has since changed since we had the Boudreaux decision, which was a caregiver and her veteran husband that brought forward a case against the VA for them
Mhm,
dropping them from the program.
mhm,
And the end result was a class action lawsuit.
mhm.
Originally, the program did not allow veterans and caregivers to apply to the VBA side of the VA of the Department of Veterans Affairs. It's split into two. You have your VHA side, your Veterans Health Administration,
Right,
and then you have your VBA, your Veterans Benefits Administration.
right.
They're separate entities. Typically, all claims for benefits come through the Veterans Benefits Administration. But this particular program, the way that they have worded the legislation, it is considered a medical determination. And therefore, it is to remain within the Veterans Health Administration. And it does not follow the normal appellate process that one would have. It
Mhm,
follows an internal appellate process that is it's very obscure. You don't ever get to talk to anybody. You don't know that your information has ever been reviewed.
right,
It's just a very bureaucratic system that you don't really ever seem to get anywhere.
right.
As a result of the Boudreaux decision, every veteran who has applied for this program and been denied or revoked now has the ability to reapply to the board,
Right.
to the VBA, to have that case reviewed. A lot of what I discovered over the last 5 years are hidden in files that we don't see.
Yeah.
There's a file within the VA called the Karma file This file used to be the CATS and PATS file, which was the Caregiver Application Tracking System and the Patient Advocate Tracking System, I believe were the acronyms for those two programs that have now been merged in October of 2020 into the KARMA system.
Mm-hmm.
This is an internal system that the VA keeps, and it is only available by FOIA request, but it is within that system that I found all kinds of misinformation that had been inputted by the caregiver support staff about my husband, about his injuries, that was categorically false without any evidence whatsoever to back it up. And none of it was inputted by a physician, a doctor, anyone treating him. It was by the social worker that had been assigned to our case.
But
not anyone who had ever met my husband. I don't even believe she had ever spoken with my husband other than to gain his permission to work with me.
But why?
The only explanation I've been able to come to after all of these years is that it is a way of spoiling evidence. It is a way of planting evidence that they can later cite to go back and use as reason for denying veterans, reason for denying them this program. And most people aren't aware that this file exists. These aren't things you're going to find in your blue button medical report on My Healthy eVet. These are within, and they're very ambiguous with the program. When you receive a program denial, I know our letters would say, oh, you didn't qualify in category 1, 3, and 5. But they don't tell you what those categories involved or what the requirements are to qualify within those categories. It's very ambiguous, and that makes it really difficult for the veteran and the caregiver of how to go about navigating this system. And most are not successful. As I shared, only about 13% of veterans and caregivers are actually successful in gaining acceptance into the program.
You know, I was watching something where it was dealing with the veteran caregiver program, and it talked to the fact that they're going to deny, like you cited, and they expect that caregiver or that veteran to not appeal because
Yes.
so burned out, they're exhausted on being whipped and in the spin cycle of the bureaucrat system. I didn't say bureaucrat, I said bureaucrat.
I like that.
You know why? Because it is, you know.
That's what it is.
They are doing that to our veteran community. And when is it going to stop? Where do we say the buck stops here? So these veterans can get this help. And the thing is, you have built this bridge for your husband and for your SEAL community in California. And the resources that you have researched and have made your own is huge. But what do we say to the veterans and the caregivers and the spouses who are saying, but I don't have access to that. I don't have access to this. I'm about to give up. What do you say to them knowing that you have walked this journey and sometimes you wonder if the light was even at the end of the tunnel?
I would say don't give up. Definitely don't give up. The resources are there. There's a lot more resources there now than when my husband retired in 2014. Mm-hmm. Finding these resources is more of a challenge. Many of them you can find through a Google search. Community organizations that support your specific military community. For us, it was NSW. So really just reaching out to leadership, other spouses, trying to just gain information from other people around me to find out what those resources were and build out this list and try to present it and promote it to as many people as I possibly can. Mm-hmm. Just getting that resource component. When we're armed with tools, we're able to do a lot more. And as caregivers, we're often that lighthouse, guiding the way for everybody else in the family, including the veteran. Mm-hmm. So having those resources, those tools of support could not be more important when you're coming out of the military. That transition, we become very accustomed to the command helping, that command being there and turning to them for our needs. And when that is absent, and the resource that you have to turn to, the main one is the Department of Veterans Affairs, it's not the most fulfilling end result.
Right.
So a lot of that is incumbent upon us, unfortunately. There are some wonderful organizations there's a couple that come to the top of my head
Okay.
that I think of specifically initially for caregivers. We have to take care of ourselves.
Yes.
We have to refill that well. And there are organizations that support spouses. Operation Healing Forces is one that I'd really like to give a shout out to. They're dedicated to providing retreats for caregivers and beautiful locations to spend some time decompressing and getting to know other caregivers that are in similar positions and just taking some time for yourself to refill that well. That's one organization and one resource I recommend to everybody to look up and reach out to them. Look at their different retreat options because they can be very healing. The Marcus Institute for Brain Health is a similar model to that of NICO. NICO was the National Intrepid Center of Excellence. We have one in Bethesda that is connected to Walter Reed. We also have one here at Camp Pendleton for the NICO West. The Marcus Institute is on the veteran side of the house, but they are going to give a really good assessment of everything that is going on underneath, all of those invisible injuries that are going on. And you have a team of doctors there to work with the veteran and uncover all of that, find appropriate treatment modalities and help move you through that process. But they're also very supportive and integrate that family component in. Bring that spouse in for sessions. And I was there at the beginning for his initial consultation, and I was there for the last week at the end, learning about everything from the doctors, really being educated on his needs, moving forward, tools for myself. So that's another organization, an institution that I highly recommend.
Okay.
They have no cost to the veterans. They do not have veterans come out of pocket. So if it is somebody who is struggling with a gap in insurance needs or doesn't have enough coverage, the Marcus Institute for Brain Health is an excellent resource for them.
Out of all of the resources out there, and it's great that there are so many veteran service organizations out there. You got the Gary Sinise Foundation, you got Hope for the Warriors, you have Wounded Warrior Project, but it can become so overwhelming.
It really can.
To the veteran, to the spouse, and hearing about, this Fairways for Warriors. And I had never heard of that before. And I thought, oh, wow, what a great idea. And they are national, but they're local.
Yes.
If that makes sense. So with all of these resources, where does somebody say, okay, do I go on a recommendation? Or do I just do a quick Google search and say, oh, there's a Gary Sinise Foundation. Maybe they will help me. What?
I think both.
You think both?
I think both. I think out of the box. So however that's going to get you the resources you need, ask people, reach out to other caregivers, find some of these support groups. Veteran Warriors is an excellent advocacy organization that centers on the burn pits and the caregiver program. Those are their two main topics that they focus on. And they are a wealth of knowledge for both of those programs and how to navigate them. Individual resources can be more of a challenge to find. And that's where you try to turn back to your community, your military community, and talk, make those connections with other people, other organizations, ask if they know about other organizations.
Right.
And really that's how I started, just finding out and working my way through that process. But I recognize it's not an easy process. And as caregivers, we're already fairly inundated and buried with all of the demands that are placed on us as it is. To take something else on can be a lot, and we don't always have that time, but it can provide tremendous benefit for us as the caregivers to find and search out those resources and use them, use the tools.
What is one word of one sentence of advice you would love to give to a caregiver out there who may say, is it even worth me fighting? Because so many, I think, are at a point where they are struggling to say, okay, what's the next thing? And what would be one piece of advice that you would give them because of the constant denial process? And you and I both know how that looks and how that has unfolded. And the appeal process can be even more inundated. And I said this, I did an interview earlier today. I was being interviewed as a former candidate and a veteran spouse. And I reminded the audience that we, the people, have a voice. And I reminded the audience that our local, our state, and our federal officials that we put in place there, we hold them accountable. So at the end of the
Absolutely.
day, you, me, and every other veteran spouse, in many ways, the world is at our fingertips.
That's true. And it's up to us.
It is up to us. So without taking any words out of your mouth, I mean, what would be one piece of advice you would give a spouse?
At this point in the process, because the process for the caregiver support program has changed substantially over the last 5 years that I have been involved with this program, I wouldn't give up now.
Right.
Mainly because of the class action lawsuit and that Boudreaux decision providing that proper due process for veterans to be able to appeal the Veterans Board, the Veterans Benefits Administration. That component was something I argued and fought about with legislators for years, that this needed to change. This is the component that's missing, that if people have access to this, it may be a long time. We know that the VBA is not the fastest entity as far as putting out decisions.
Right.
But I do feel like you're going to have a fairer look coming from the VBA than my experience with the VHA. I personally do not have much faith in the typical appellate process with the caregiver program, nor the application process. My faith now comes from the Veterans Benefits Administration and the veteran and caregiver having access for that review now, that judicial review.
As we head into Memorial Day, as we head into the summer, we have July 4th, and then we have November with Veterans Day. We have so many different patriotic holidays, but also it can be hard on the veteran, the family, depending on what they are being surrounded with, especially as we head into Memorial Day. Do you have any words of advice in the process that every year it comes around? A lot of families do their picnics and they gather together, but then you have the other side. What would be your advice to the spouse who needs a little bit of extra comfort during that time period when they see what continues to happen?
Be patient, find that place of empathy, because what can be very celebratory times for other people can be really traumatic times for others. The 4th of July fireworks I think about, and it's beautiful for so many, but it can prompt flashbacks and really of traumatic experiences for others. So be patient and don't try to conform to any idea that you have to be celebrating something in a certain way. Be true to you, be true to the veteran of what their need is at that time. And what it may be this year is probably going to evolve as it does. The typical trajectory for invisible injuries is different. When you have a typical injury, you break your arm or your leg,
Right.
you have a recovery trajectory that, goes in a certain direction. But with invisible injuries, it is very much up and down, and there are plateaus, and you might make some progress and see a bit of regression. That's just the nature of the beast. So finding that patience, including with holidays, finding unconventional ways that are maybe more suited to your family, to your veteran, to honor those days.
Yes. Well, Jennifer Moffat, I am going to bring you back because we have so much more to talk about. And I know that the veteran community here in Eastern North Carolina could use a dose of your resilience and your warrior, like Proverbs 31 like-minded approach. You lean in, you are discerning, you look at everything around you, and you are a resource to so many women, spouses, etc. And so I'm excited to bring you back because I know you have more coming down the pike, especially as we get this resource list together for so many veteran spouses out there who may be looking for an additional dose of injection of love and hope and support. So I look forward to having you back. And thank you for your service. And you are a Tillman Scholar, and I want everybody to go check out the website that hosts your bio. You are a dedicated advocate for our veterans. You are a proud wife of a Navy SEAL. Thank you to your husband and your family, and to the whole California military community out there. We thank you and we honor you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Eden, to you and your husband as well.
My pleasure. We look forward to having you come back soon. Thank you.
I would love that. Thank you very much.